Ada's breaths were shallow. Machines beeped frantically in the ICU as doctors rushed in, voices urgent, hands moving fast. Outside the glass, David stood frozen, his jaw tight, eyes darting between the lifeless figure on the bed and Gloria, standing far too close beside him. Their shoulders almost touched, but neither spoke. Through the window, a nurse covered Ada's face with a sheet. In the corridor, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. Gloria's hand brushed his, almost like a signal. In that instant, it was clear not everyone outside that room was praying for Ada to live. But who exactly were they to each other? And what was so important that it could wait until she was gone? Welcome to the Judge Stories, where every betrayal has its day in court. Stay with us. The full story is about to unfold. And if you love tales where justice comes for those who think they've won, hit that subscribe button. Your next verdict is coming. Ada Ajayi's life began in the worn, crowded dormitories of God's Grace Orphanage in Abeokuta. The sound of children's chatter filled the air during the day, but at night, the creaks of the old building and the distant hum of generators were a lullaby. She wore hand-me-down uniforms and shoes with thin soles, yet she always stood out in the front row of her class, jotting every word the teacher spoke. Her determination was unshakable. When the generator failed, she studied by candlelight. When the noise in the orphanage became too loud, she retreated to the corner with a borrowed book. Other children might have dreamed in bursts, but Ada's dreams were steady, deliberate, and rooted in the belief that she could shape her own future. At 17, her hard work paid off when she earned a full scholarship to the University of Lagos. The campus, with its sprawling lawns and lively lecture halls, became her new battleground. She attended lectures religiously, worked part-time at a stationery shop to cover personal expenses, and saved every naira she could. It was during a student entrepreneurship workshop that she noticed him for the first time, a tall young man standing at the back of the hall. David Ajayi had a confident smile and wore an expensive wristwatch that didn't quite match the setting. Throughout the presentations, Ada felt his gaze on her, but they did not speak that day. She left the workshop without a second glance, walking briskly toward the hostel, her mind already on the next assignment. She had no idea that this quiet moment, a passing glance, would mark the beginning of a connection that would one day change everything. 2 weeks after the entrepreneurship workshop, Ada sat in the university library, poring over her notes for an upcoming economics test. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rows of bookshelves. She was so focused on the page in front of her that she didn't notice someone approach until a deep, confident voice broke the silence. "Mind if I sit here?" She looked up to see David Ajayi standing before her, a faint smile on his lips. Up close, he looked even more self-assured, his neatly trimmed hair and well-pressed shirt setting him apart from the casual look of most students. "It's a free seat," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. He set his books down and eased into the chair opposite hers. For a few minutes, they studied in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the library's ceiling fans. Then he leaned forward slightly. "I've seen you around. You always look so serious. Do you ever take a break?" She glanced at him, amused despite herself. "Breaks are for people who can afford to fall behind. I'm not one of them." That answer seemed to intrigue him. He asked her about her course of study, her goals, and eventually about her work at the stationery shop. Ada answered in short sentences, offering little beyond what was necessary. Yet, something about his curiosity felt different from the usual idle chatter of other students. Over the next several days, they crossed paths more often, sometimes at the library, sometimes on the lagoon-front walkway where students went to relax. Each time, David initiated the conversation, gradually learning more about her life, though she gave little away. For Ada, he remained just another acquaintance, but for David, each interaction was a step closer to understanding and eventually exploiting the woman who would one day become his wife. By her final year at the University of Lagos, Ada had built a small but profitable side business supplying students with printed course materials and affordable stationery. Her knack for organization and her sharp negotiation skills caught the attention of a visiting professor who recommended her for a graduate entrepreneurship fellowship in Yaba. The fellowship opened doors Ada had only dreamed of. She gained access to Lagos's growing tech and business hub, meeting investors, mentors, and other ambitious young entrepreneurs. The environment was competitive, but Ada thrived, often staying late into the night to refine her business plans and pitch decks. David was present in her life more often now. He visited her at the co-working space, sometimes offering to walk her home, sometimes bringing food when she forgot to eat. Ada appreciated the gestures but remained cautious. She had learned early in life that kindness could come with conditions. By the time she graduated, Ada had secured her first round of funding. With that capital, she launched a logistics tech company aimed at helping small businesses distribute goods more efficiently across Nigeria. Her hands-on approach impressed clients, and her insistence on transparency earned her loyal partners. As the company grew, so did her public profile. Invitations to business panels and networking events began to pour in. At one such rooftop networking gala in Victoria Island, Ada stood with a group of investors discussing expansion strategies. David was there too, moving easily through the crowd, greeting people with the charm of someone born to socialize. It was a polished, exciting world, far from the orphanage dormitories where her journey began. But Ada never forgot where she came from, nor the children who still slept under flickering bulbs at God's Grace Orphanage. She began setting aside a portion of her profits to send books and supplies there, a quiet act she never publicized. Success had transformed Ada's life, but it had also changed her relationship with David. By the time they married in a tasteful ceremony in Victoria Island, Ada's company had expanded into multiple states, and her name was appearing in business magazines. David, however, had no clear career path of his own. He often described himself as a consultant, but Ada noticed he spent more time at social gatherings than in any actual office. At first, she brushed it off as a difference in personalities. He was outgoing, she was focused. He worked the room, she worked the numbers. But small signs began to trouble her. He stayed out late without explanation. His phone was always locked, and he stepped outside to take certain calls. It was at a grand ballroom charity gala, hosted at a luxury hotel in Ikoyi, that Ada first noticed Gloria in David's orbit. Gloria had been her friend since their early entrepreneurial days, a woman of striking beauty with light brown skin, sleek wigs, and a taste for bold jewelry. They had once spent hours brainstorming business ideas together, but Gloria's ventures had never taken off. That night, Ada spotted them across the room, David leaning in slightly as Gloria laughed, her hand brushing his arm. It was fleeting, subtle enough to be dismissed as friendly banter, yet it lingered in Ada's mind long after the event. From then on, she began to see patterns she hadn't noticed before. Gloria's name would come up in casual conversation, or David would mention running into her at events where Ada hadn't been invited. Ada told herself not to jump to conclusions, but somewhere in her gut, the unease was growing, and she didn't yet know that the truth ran far deeper than she imagined. The months that followed were a blur of board meetings, client contracts, and late nights at the office. Ada pushed herself harder than ever, determined to keep her company at the top. But the fatigue that had been gnawing at her for weeks could no longer be ignored. One morning, after nearly collapsing during a presentation, Ada finally went to a private hospital in Ikoyi for a full checkup. The pristine white walls, the smell of antiseptic, and the quiet hum of air conditioning felt oddly oppressive. 2 days later, she sat across from her doctor as he delivered the news: early-stage breast cancer. The words seemed to echo in her ears, their weight sinking in slowly. David was supportive, at least at first. He held her hand during the initial consultations, insisted on driving her to appointments, and told her not to worry about the business. But as the weeks went by and her treatment began, Ada noticed subtle changes. He no longer stayed the entire time during her chemotherapy sessions. His calls grew less frequent when he traveled. What troubled her most, however, was Gloria's increasing presence. Gloria began visiting their home, to check in on Ada, often arriving when David was already there. They would talk in low tones in the kitchen, conversations that stopped abruptly when Ada entered the room. One afternoon, while resting in bed, Ada overheard them laughing together in the living room. It was a sound that should have brought comfort, yet instead, it sent a cold shiver down her spine. She told herself she needed her strength for the battle ahead. But somewhere in her heart, she began to suspect she was fighting more than just her illness. The rain had been falling steadily all afternoon, tapping against the bedroom window as Ada sat propped up in bed. Her laptop was open to a set of quarterly reports, but her eyes kept drifting toward the muffled voices coming from downstairs. David had returned from what he claimed was a business meeting, and Gloria had arrived barely 20 minutes later. Their laughter floated up the staircase, followed by the sound of clinking glasses. Ada's chest tightened. She reached for her phone, intending to distract herself with emails, but a notification caught her eye, a message from David's tablet, which had synced to her account months ago when they shared devices. The preview was enough to stop her cold. "She won't be around much longer. We just have to be patient." Her hands trembled as she opened the message thread. What she found confirmed every suspicion. Months of exchanges between David and Gloria, laced with intimacy and casual cruelty. They had been involved long before her diagnosis, and their plan was chillingly clear: wait for her to die, then marry, inheriting her entire fortune. Ada closed the laptop, her mind racing. She felt the sting of betrayal, but also the spark of something else: resolve. If this was the game they were playing, she would rewrite the rules. That evening, after David left for a late dinner with a client, Ada called her lawyer, Barrister Femi Adeoye. They met the next morning in his Lekki office, glass walls framing the busy streets below. With calm precision, Ada instructed him to amend her will, leaving every kobo of her fortune to God's Grace Orphanage and scheduling the reading for 3 months after her death. When she left the office, the rain had stopped. The air was clear, the streets washed clean, and for the first time in weeks, Ada felt the same way. From that day forward, Ada lived with 2 battles, one for her health and one for the justice she intended to deliver. She moved quietly, never letting David or Gloria suspect a thing. Her visits to God's Grace Orphanage became more frequent, though she told David they were simply a way to lift her spirits. She oversaw the construction of a new library wing, the delivery of computers, and the renovation of the dining hall. The children's laughter gave her strength, and Mama Tay, the orphanage matron, often noticed the glimmer of peace in her eyes despite her illness. Barrister Femi handled the legal side of her plan with meticulous care. The will was sealed, its execution date set exactly 3 months after her passing. Confidentiality agreements ensured that no one could leak its contents prematurely. David, oblivious, continued to play the doting husband in public while spending more time with Gloria in private. They attended gallery openings, brunches, and charity luncheons, sometimes even within weeks of Ada's worst treatment days. Ada began keeping a journal, detailing her thoughts and the truth about their betrayal. She intended it to be read alongside the will, not out of spite, but as a record of why her fortune would go to the children who had once been her only family. As her health slowly declined, she stopped attending high-profile business events, allowing David to stand in for her. The tabloids praised him for his devotion, never knowing that behind closed doors, he was already rehearsing his new life. By early September, Ada's strength had begun to fade rapidly. The chemotherapy sessions were shorter now, more to ease her symptoms than to fight the disease. She spent most days at home, surrounded by soft Ankara blankets and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. David's visits to her hospital room became less frequent, and when he did appear, his phone was always in hand. Gloria visited more than he did, often with a bouquet of flowers or a basket of fruit, gestures that felt hollow. One crisp Friday morning, Ada asked Barrister Femi to bring the final documents for her will. They met in her hospital suite, the blinds half drawn against the rising sun. Her signature was steady, her gaze unwavering as she confirmed every clause. She reminded him again. The will was not to be read until 3 months after her passing. The following week, Ada insisted on one last visit to God's Grace Orphanage. Mama Tay was waiting at the gate, arms open, tears already in her eyes. The children swarmed Ada, clinging to her hands, asking when she would come again. She smiled at them, hiding the truth. That day, she walked slowly through every room, touching the walls, the desks, the new shelves in the library. It was her final goodbye. 2 weeks later, Ada slipped into a coma at the private Ikoyi hospital. David was outside the ICU when it happened, Gloria beside him as doctors rushed in. Hours later, the flatline came. David did not cry. Gloria squeezed his hand. And just like that, the woman they had both underestimated was gone, or so they thought. In the weeks following Ada's funeral, David and Gloria maintained a carefully measured public image. At first, they appeared together only at large social gatherings, speaking politely to one another as if their closeness was born of shared grief. But as the weeks passed, their restraint faded. They were photographed at charity auctions, art gallery openings, and weekend brunches in Lekki. On social media, subtle posts began to appear, Gloria's hand on David's arm at a restaurant, David's voice in the background of a video she posted from Cape Town. The public's response was divided. Some defended them, insisting they had the right to move on. Others questioned the timing, whispering about how quickly they had found comfort in each other's company. Tabloids speculated, but no one could prove anything concrete. David ignored the criticism. He was focused on what he believed was inevitable, the formal transfer of Ada's vast fortune into his name. Gloria, for her part, began making quiet inquiries about potential properties they could purchase together, even discussing plans for a wedding when the time was right. In their minds, they had survived the hardest part. The woman whose shadow loomed over their relationship was gone, and in a matter of weeks, the wealth she left behind would be theirs. Neither of them suspected that the real blow was still to come, and that it would arrive in the most public way possible. The boardroom of barrister Femi Adeoye's Victoria Island law firm was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the polished mahogany table. Reporters gathered outside in the hallway, their murmurs faint but constant. David sat at the head of the table, dressed in a charcoal gray suit. Gloria was beside him in a cream-lace dress and matching gelly, her jewelry understated but expensive. A few representatives from God's Grace Orphanage sat further down, their Ankara outfits adding a burst of color to the otherwise formal setting. Barrister Femi entered, carrying a sealed brown envelope. The room fell silent. He broke the wax seal and unfolded the document, adjusting his glasses as he began to read. Ada Ajayi, being of sound mind and body at the time of writing, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. David listened with a calm expression at first, confident in what he thought he was about to inherit. But as the clauses unfolded, his composure began to crack. To my beloved husband, David Ajayi, I leave nothing. Gasps echoed around the table. Gloria's hand froze on the tablecloth. Barrister Femi continued. I'm aware of your long-standing affair with Gloria Abiola, which began before my illness. I delayed the reading of this will for 3 months after my passing, so that the world would see your true character. Every kobo of my estate, valued at $10 billion is to be transferred to God's Grace Orphanage. The room erupted. The orphanage representatives covered their mouths in shock, tears streaming down their faces. David's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against the table. Gloria stared straight ahead, her face drained of color. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Headlines, social media feeds, and evening news broadcasts. Public outrage was swift and merciless. David and Gloria's names became synonymous with greed and betrayal, their reputations shattered beyond repair. And in the quiet corners of Lagos, people spoke of Ada Ajayi, the orphan who rose to unimaginable heights, the mogul who built an empire, and the woman who, even in death, had the last word. Months after the will reading, God's Grace Orphanage had been transformed. The once fading buildings now gleamed with fresh paint. New dormitories housed twice as many children. The library was filled with books, computers, and study tables. A playground stood where there had once been bare ground. Mama Tea often stood at the entrance gate in the evenings, watching the children run and laugh, their futures brighter than ever before. She knew they had Ada to thank for it all. David, meanwhile, had vanished from Lagos's social scene. Whispers placed him living in a modest flat on the mainland, avoiding the cameras that once chased him. Gloria's PR firm quietly folded, her once busy phone now silent. Barrister Femi kept Ada's journal locked in his office safe. It was a record not just of betrayal, but of vision, a reminder that her final act was not driven by revenge alone, but by the same determination that had defined her life, to protect and uplift the children who had once been her only family. And so Ada Ajayi's legacy endured, not in the bank accounts of those who betrayed her, but in the laughter of children, the turning of pages in a library, and the unshakable truth that even in death, she had chosen her own ending.